this kind of commitment at the G8 summit this year in Aquila. I've already given the examples of the Europe and United States with targets in the right direction. We're starting as a world to share the understanding of where we need to be. That's very positive, and it's actually fairly recent. It's the last 3, 4, 5 years, more recently, of course, in the United States. China is working. China knows that it's extremely vulnerable. The big rivers of China rise in the Himalayas. The melting of the snow and ice in the Himalayas will radically transform water in China. The biggest cities of China are mostly close to the sea, are very vulnerable to sea level rise. China understands it's vulnerable. China understands it's potentially a deal breaker. It's concentrating very hard, working on an energy strategy, feeding into the 12th five-year plan, which starts at the beginning of 2011. And unlike India, China has actually worked out its five-year plan before the plan period begins. And they're looking at these issues extremely seriously and carefully. The leadership in China is in large measure engineers, indeed engineers who graduated from Tsinghua University. Very practical, numerate, analytical about the risks that are being run, and about what needs to be done, and about the kind of technologies that are necessary. So actually we can see quite clearly the scale of the action that we need to take as a world, getting down to 20 gigatons. We can see the kinds of areas that we need to act to do that. They're fairly simple, and you know them very well here at the EBRD. It's energy efficiency, it's low carbon technologies, and it's stopping deforestation. Those are the three broad areas. We have to act right across the economy. It's about buildings, it's about agriculture, it's about transport, it's about power, it's about heating. It's all these things. So you have to act right across the economy. We can see what's the problem in terms of the economics. The problem in terms of the economics is that these emissions, particularly carbon dioxide, is not priced. The market is failing. It's the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. People pay for the labour in the goods that they buy and take that for granted, and the market signals the cost of labour, it signals the cost of raw materials, signals the cost of capital, but it's not signalling the cost of the damage caused by emissions. It's a market failure. What do? Well, you don't abandon the markets, you don't abandon banking because banking's got into serious trouble, you try and fix it. So the right thing to do is try and fix those markets. What you have to do, price for carbon, can be taxation, can be carbon trading. You have to try to bring forward the technologies. This is the failure in the carbon market is not the only market failure here. There's lots of market failures associated with the creation of new ideas. There are market failures associated with the way that housing markets work and the ability of people who invest in green buildings to get the extra rent associated with those buildings. There are a number of market failures that are relevant here, and that means that we're going to need a price for carbon, ways of bringing on new technologies, not just the development but also the deployment, like feed-in tariffs. And it means that in some areas, emissions from cars, emissions from houses and so on, we're going to need regulation. So we can see the quantities that we need, 20 gigatons. We can see the areas we have to act. We can see the economic instruments. What's missing is the political will. That's all, you know. Now, how do you get there? Well, you have to understand first some of the costs involved in making the change. This is firstly about a period of transition. The word resonates here, and for very good reason. This is about transition to a low-carbon economy. That transition will be a Schumpeterian period of innovation and investment and growth. Schumpeter, the great Austrian economic historian, economic theorist who wrote a lot of his stuff in Harvard, had this story of innovation and new technologies driving growth. He spoke of the railways, electricity, the motor car, and more recently we would speak of information technology. This transition is going to be, if managed well, a period of very powerful growth. When we get to a low-carbon economy, we'll have something which is more energy secure, safer, quieter, more biodiverse. So the transition itself will be a dynamic process, but a process which requires investment and cost. And when we get there, we're in a really attractive place. So here we've got a policy which helps us come out of the recession in the very short run, because there are many kinds of energy efficiency investments which are quite labour intensive and intensive in labour in the building sector, that takes us to a period of very rapid growth of the Schumpeterian variety that I described for 2 or 3 decades, and it takes us to a very much more attractive form of growth, and it reduces, and this is where we began most fundamentally, it reduces the probability of the disastrous climate change. This is a no-brainer, yeah? That this is what we have to do. What levels of investment? Well, we've worked out and burrowed away and built economic models on the kinds of investment costs that might be required over these next 2, 3, 4 decades. It comes out at 1 or 2% of GDP. There are lots of ways of doing that. Other people come out with much lower numbers than that, actually, the International Energy Agency, McKinsey's and so on. I've been a bit conservative because as an economist I've found that in life it makes sense to allow for bad policy and for costs that turn out, that could be lower but don't turn out to be as low as you thought. And in the 1 or 2% there's quite a lot of allowance for that. One way of getting at that, multiplication here, we have to take out, to get down to 20 gigatons, we're already at 50, we'll rise at, under business as usual, probably something like 85 by 2050. So 85 down to 20 is taking out 65. If we did that, 65 gigatons. If we did that at $30 a ton, then $30 times 65 gigaton, remembering that giga and billion are the same. Scientists like giga and economists like billion. So you've got to multiply $30 per ton by 65 billion tons. The 30 times 65 is easy, but you just have to get your decimal points in the right place. It's 1.95 trillion, 2 trillion. Where will we be as a world in 2050? With good policies, including on climate change, we could easily double world GDP, take it from 50 trillion or so now, a bit more, to a bit more than 100 trillion. That makes the percentages easy. 2 trillion divided by 100, 2%. There's quite a lot of slack, actually, in that arithmetic that I've given you. And we have all the other co-benefits that I described. It's not just cost. It's not just burden sharing. It's about getting on to a different form of dynamics, a different form of growth for the economy. So that's the story. It's a quite simple story. The challenge is political will. How do you get there? How do you build the international collaboration that's necessary? What does a global deal that's effective on the scale required, efficient, keep the costs down, and equitable, what does it look like? Well, I've more or less described the guts of that global deal in what I've already said. First, the 50% targets overall, 1990 to 2050, get down to the 20 gigatons, and within that, at least 80% from the rich countries. There's a great inequity here, and the rich countries are largely responsible for the bad position where we start, and it's the poor countries that get hit earliest and hardest, but the developing world, currently developing world, is going to be 8 billion out of the 9 billion. If the rich world's output was 0 of emissions in 2050, you're dividing 20 by 8, not by 9. It's going to have to be 2.5 tons per capita. It simply cannot work unless the developing world is centrally involved. That means that the rich countries have got not only to take these targets, but they've got to share the technologies as the technologies are developed. Actually, many of them will be developed in the developing world as well. We've got to share those technologies, help